My name is Dr. Chris Jenkins, and I am the CEO of the Orianne Society and the host of the Snake Talk podcast, the podcast where you learn about nature's most feared, maligned, and persecuted animals. I invite you to listen to this conversation, and maybe you'll find that what you perceive as fear is actually rooted in a deep fascination. Welcome to the Snake Talk podcast. We have an interesting one today, one that I'm very excited about. We are sitting down with the executive director and founder of the Rattlesnake Conservancy, Tony Daly-Crews. And as the audience knows, I am, despite working on a whole variety of species, many of which aren't even snakes, my true love and what I've really been focused on over my career is working with vipers. And so I've been really happy that here in North America, we have I guess it would be here in the Americas, we have an organization that is focused now exclusively on rattlesnakes. And it's just, again, one of my loves. I've been working on rattlesnakes my entire career at the Orianne Society. We have a big focus on timber rattlesnakes in the Appalachian mountain chain, and I've worked out west on a number of different snake species, and many years ago founded and chaired the Viper Specialist Group for IUCN, which we may talk about today because I know Tony's been working with them more recently. And just really excited to have this conversation and excited to learn more about the organization. So welcome to the podcast, Tony. How you doing today?
Well, thanks, Chris. Doing great. Glad to be on here and talk with you a little bit about rattlesnakes.
Good. Well, as you may know, I like to start my episodes by learning about how my guests got to where they are today. And I like to start at the very beginning because this thing that's quite normal to me and you, meaning snakes and an interest in snakes, to most people in, say, the United States or the world, is actually kind of way outside the box. And people often have other emotions towards these animals than we do. So I always like to learn that origin story, especially with you, someone who obviously has, even like me, even a finer focus on the venomous species. And so how did that start for you? Was that something that happened early in life or something that came about later? What's kind of that origin story for you?
Yeah, so, a lot of people, like you mentioned, may not have had interest in snakes or reptiles their entire life. And I'm actually one that fits in the category of people that did not develop a love for snakes, or did develop a love for snakes later in life. When I was younger, I was scared of snakes. My parents were pretty anti-snakes, things like that. So it wasn't until I was older, entering late high school years, early college, that I started developing a lot more interest in lizards and eventually snakes. And I tell people all the time that it's not that I have a particular allure to venomous species. It's just that all the ones that I really like happen to be venomous. And principally, rattlesnakes are the ones that really interest me. And, as far as getting involved with the Rattlesnake Conservancy and founding the organization, it was simply when I saw a need. There wasn't any sort of group that was having major advocacy programs for rattlesnakes. Aside from, some efforts here and there of a few different organizations, there wasn't anyone that was wholly focused on the work. And it was something that I was interested in trying to stand up. And, it's quite the hill to climb, but we love what we do. And I think we're doing a lot of amazing work now.
Great. So you said, and as you may know, I've told the story a few times in different places, but I'm very similar to you in that I've been into wildlife my whole life, but an interest in snakes and in particular venomous snakes, came more, when I was in college and a little bit later in life for me too, but you mentioned well, first of all, I stated, currently you're sitting as executive director of this organization that you started, but when was it that you realized, you started this interest in snakes, but when was it that you realized, oh, I could have a career focused on wildlife and maybe more specifically with snakes? Is that something that hit you around that time or something kind of a little bit later?
Yeah, it was about 10 years ago. And, when I first started having an interest in snakes, I certainly didn't think that a career, at least on the conservation side, would be possible right away. I certainly, kind of started a little bit more on the captive wildlife side. And, I started developing a lot more love for seeing these animals in the wild and conservation programs associated with them. So, it was a few years after I got my interest in snakes. I was like, there's some potential here to really be able to do something for these species and, give them a voice where they don't have one.
Mm-hmm. And your path to this was maybe slightly different. It's a very interesting one to me, slightly different than some people who currently work with snakes or, whether they run a nonprofit or do something else, and that you went into biology and, for a number of years, you kind of worked these other careers in wildlife and management and conservation with groups like Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, and but instead of like leaving those positions and starting the nonprofit, you use those positions as a good background or a backbone or a framework for you to then create this new nonprofit. So I guess first of all, how did you get into doing wildlife and conservation related work with some of these government agencies? I'm assuming you went to school and studied some form of wildlife or environmental science or something of that nature.
Yeah, I went to school for ecology and evolutionary biology. I only have an undergraduate degree. It's a bachelor's of science. Most of my school has been in the field and dealing with this work for many years. I'm actually a veteran myself, Army veteran. And while I was in college, an opportunity came up for an internship with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service while I was there. And I started, I think it's my junior year of college while I was there. And about 6 months after starting with the service, before I graduated, I actually got hired full-time as a Fish and Wildlife Service biologist, working in Jacksonville on endangered species, principally eastern indigo snakes, Florida sand skinks, scrub jays, things like that. So many of our Florida endemic species and some non-endemic species that we worked on in northern Florida. And I feel like my background in starting with the government really helped shape who I am today to be an effective leader for my organization because, the connections that I made, the partnerships that I made with agency officials and learning the legal side of dealing with endangered species and policy and lawmaking, really, I think, helped put me in a great position to be able to navigate potentially contentious issues with rattlesnakes, looking at, potential legislative changes, regulatory changes, things like that. Even back in 2016, I sat on the Florida Venomous Reptile Technical Assistance Group that was revising the, state regulations for keeping venomous reptiles in captivity and things like that. But, without the experiences I had working at the government agencies that I did, I'm not sure I would be in the same position I am today to effectively lead the organization.
Yeah, that's great. Well, when was it or how did it come about? So you're working, like I mentioned, for these other federal agencies or other entities where you're doing wildlife related work, policy, management, conservation, and you have this interest in snakes that's developing, had been developing for a while. And when was it that you decided, and maybe not so much the when, the when's fine to hear too, but it's really the kind of the thought process behind when you finally decided to make that jump, that I'm going to do something and create something that's specific for snakes and rattlesnakes in particular?
Yeah, it was back in 2015. that myself and Chase Pirtle, who's the natural resource manager at Ashton Biological Preserve, were sitting on my back porch, knocking back a couple of beers and thinking about, hey, what can we do to do good things for rattlesnakes, and find a way to turn our passion into a career and have some sort of advocacy. And at the time, it was just a half-baked idea of a couple of guys sitting on the back porch, a little buzz from too many beers, and the next day, I was like, you know what? Let's go ahead and get this process started. And, we started pretty unofficially in the beginning. We hadn't gone through all the 501c3 process and all of that, because I certainly was a neophyte in that territory at the time of figuring out how to navigate some of the more bureaucratic portions of managing a nonprofit. But a couple of years later in 2017, because originally we were formed as the Eastern Diamondback Conservation Foundation, and we rebranded in 2017 to have a focus on all rattlesnake species, not just Eastern Diamondbacks, although they certainly are one of our focal species that we work with. In 2017, we were officially formed as a 501c3 as the Rattlesnake Conservancy, and very quickly from that point on, we expanded and changed our programs to work with a number of different species all over the country and even internationally. Now we've got a project down in Brazil and also have one down in Mexico that we're managing right now. So it's been a slow process, but like all, kind of homegrown nonprofits, it takes time, to work through building these programs, especially when you're conserving a niche species group that it's difficult to fundraise for and things like that. It can take a lot more time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I certainly know about that. I mean, our niche is maybe a little broader. It can be difficult. But anyways, so you mentioned, so that kind of gets to kind of the origin story, and I want to talk about how the organization has grown and how you've been able to do that in such a niche, as you explained. But first, you did mention the concept of priority species, and I've seen your website multiple times and have seen that list, and it's a similar approach to what we have. We don't structure our programs by species at Orianne. They're more topically structured, but we do have a series of priority species that we put the bulk of our focus into. And so I'm curious to hear a couple of things, maybe starting off by, how did this priority species list come about? Because, again, being in a similar position to you, there's always this balance between strategy and opportunity, right? And so I'm curious how you've developed that priority species list over time. And then what does it mean to be a priority species within the Rattlesnake Conservancy? Like, let's just say, obviously, Eastern Diamondback rattlesnake is one of your priority species, but maybe a prairie rattlesnake is not. Do you do any work on prairie rattlesnakes? Is it just there's much more focus? So just talk a little bit about that priority species concept within the framework of the Rattlesnake Conservancy, and I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, so as you know, there are a lot of species of rattlesnake. Right. And it's difficult to have programs that are going to conserve every single one of them all of the time. And given our organization is principally funded by our program revenue that we generate ourselves or through grants and things like that, a lot of times our programs need to be prescriptive and focused to have on-the-ground conservation benefit, because that is one of our primary drives as an organization, is to ensure that any research that we either carry out ourselves, that we fund through grant programs that we provide or we seek funding for, are having some measurable intent of conservation focus coming out of that project. And as far as how the species were selected, there was a few things that went into how we selected focal species. One was looking at species that have some large geographic representation that would encompass the range of many other rattlesnake species. And some are more representative of the ecosystems that they occur in. For example, the New Mexico Ridge-nosed Rattlesnake, is a representative Sky Island species of rattlesnakes in the desert Southwest and in Mexico. So it's one that we know is one of two federally endangered rattlesnake species, two of which are, or I should say threatened species, two of which are focal species of the organization. And it's one that, there are potential funding opportunities available to do research programs with that species, but it's also certainly imperiled in the wild, and climate change is one of the main drivers of that species declining. Each one of these species have their own unique threats that they face, some of which are the same or similar across different species groups, if we're talking about just general persecution from the public, habitat loss and such. But there's certainly challenges that face, eastern Massasaugas and New Mexico ridge-nosed rattlesnakes and eastern diamondbacks that differ just based wholly on where they occur in the wild.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense. So you've mentioned three of them, three of your focal species. What are some of the other ones that you guys put a fair amount of effort into, you put on that list?
Yeah, the timber rattlesnake is one that we would like to get involved with more programs. We're certainly not quite as plugged into as many of the northeastern timber rattlesnake conservation groups right now as we are with some of the other species, and that's just a resources issue of being able to get around and get involved with that species group. But we do have a project that we just recently funded in the southeast for timber rattlesnakes that are going to be looking at using accelerometer data and trying to better understand how snakes react to roads in their communities, which we all know that roads are, a source of fatalities for the species, but we don't know a lot about how that impacts snake behavior beyond the actual pavement, right? And whether or not pavement or dirt road matters, in areas. So things that can be used to inform management decisions by groups, say like the U.S. Forest Service or others that are building lots of roads or deciding to abandon roads in the forest, whether it matters the width of the road, the type of substrate, et cetera, and how that impacts the species. But we try to stay as plugged in as we can into various working groups throughout the country, whether it's ones that we lead or we're involved in. And we carry out our own institutional programs where it's our staff, our conservation biologists and others that carry out the programs, or we're funding research of a graduate student or a professor that's got a particular interest in a species.
Yeah, great. So timber rattlesnakes are on that list. Are there any others that are a real focus for the group?
Yeah, right now those are the main four that we're working on. We do have a project in South America funded for Crotalus dorissus cascavea. It's a subspecies of the South American rattlesnake that, depending on which taxonomist you talk to, would tell you whether or not that's a valid subspecies or not. But that species exists in Caatinga habitat, which is more of like a desert savanna type habitat down in Brazil, and has some really unique ecology that we don't know a lot about that population of the species down there. But that's not a project that our team is carrying out as much as that we are funding and supporting the work that they're doing.
Reptiles face many challenges, from habitat loss to climate change. As an example, turtles are the most threatened group of animals on the planet, with over 60% of species classified as endangered. The Orianne Society is working hard to secure a thriving future for these incredible animals. To engage in the critical work we're doing, explore our website at www.orianne.org. There you'll find in-depth insights into the science, conservation action, and communication initiatives we're undertaking. Visit us today.
And so how do you make, I'm kind of going down tangents, but they're all interesting things to me. So how do you make that distinction? So obviously part of the business model for the Rattlesnake Conservancy is to fund other organizations, and that's one way to become a partner, or maybe to focus more directly where you have your staff working on particular projects. Maybe you're also funding for those species. But describe how that kind of works within the organization, and in terms of how those decisions are made strategically and to best affect conservation for these species?
Yeah, certainly we want to be able to carry out as much as we can with our own team and get them out in the field to carry out these projects. But we've only got so many people that work for the organization. And often, we're going after funding opportunities to try and bring people on to help. I think you recently interviewed Andy Holycross, who came on here to talk about the New Mexico Ridge-nosed Rattlesnake project that we're working with him on. We partnered with him to go after funding to hire him to work with our organization to carry out that project. So, sometimes it's just where funding is available. We'll determine whether or not we can go after something ourselves versus, us being able to fund another group where it's, they might need a small amount of money to make a large conservation impact on the ground. And it's something that's just a manpower issue. For example, Saunders Drucker, he's someone that we fund in the Desert Southwest that does work with New Mexico Ridge-nosed rattlesnakes and other montane specialists down in New Mexico and Arizona. His funding is primarily to help to make sure he's got supplies and food so he can go camp in the desert for a couple months and study these species, right? So things like that can be a big help and have a lot of on the ground conservation impact for a low dollar amount. And as I mentioned earlier, because we generate a lot of our program revenue, we have to be kind of smart about where we put that funding out there. But one of the main reasons we started our grant program was because when we started as an organization, we were having an incredibly difficult time finding any sort of funding for rattlesnake research or conservation, even for listed species like the New Mexico Ridge-nosed rattlesnake and eastern Massasauga. There just wasn't a lot of dollars out there for it. And certainly if it's one that's not a listed species, it's pretty unlikely you're getting funding unless, there's a state wildlife grant or something like that that's coming down, or maybe someone else's research you can tag on to. So we wanted to find a way to get research dollars to students and other researchers and conservation partners that are wanting to study these species, and they're having a hard time finding funding out there. So we devote a subset of our funding every year specifically to ensure that there's some money going out into the community to help support those programs.
Great. And that's kind of an interesting model because you've got, there's a lot, we're going to get into the programs and how they structure, but, you're doing a lot of the work yourself and you're granting other people money to do work. And we do the same thing, but, it requires, in terms of staffing and how you build an organization, it requires sometimes slightly different expertise. And let's just kind of talk about where you're at, like staffing wise, like you mentioned your staff a couple times, like, what are the various positions that you currently have and in the organization, and do you have like plans for the future? Like, what's the next position or two that you're just waiting to have the funding to, to hire?
Yeah. So right now we've got four full-time staff, including myself, that work for the organization. So it would be Tiffany Bright, who's my director of operations. She's kind of my right-hand person that helps with a little bit of everything. As both me as the executive director and her position, we both have to wear a lot of hats, whether that's fundraising, administrative functions, etc. We also have a conservation biologist, Alec Jarbeau. So his full-time job is getting in the field, helping with research grants, getting out and collecting data, collaborating with partners and such. And recently we also added Sean McKnight. He is our training specialist, so his full-time job is focused on working with other organizations, companies, individuals that are interested in learning how to safely work with venomous reptiles. Like recently, we did a class for the Navy Entomology Center of Excellence here in Jacksonville, and we're actually going to be likely going over to Djibouti to teach a class over in their installation in Africa and helping keep up with that. And that's just one way that we help generate revenue for our programs to be able to do things like provide grants and carry out our own research. But to answer your question about positions that I'd love to have, we're moving towards having, conservation coordinators for each region that kind of coincide with where our focal species occur, at least in the U.S. And, a big focus of mine right now is trying to get somebody on board full-time that can focus on our desert Southwest work, not only for New Mexico ridge-nosed rattlesnakes, but for other montane species, such as banded rock rattlesnakes and twin-spotted rattlesnakes that are great indicator species to look at for impacts from climate change in the Sky Islands of the desert Southwest. So we're going to be going after some funding sources from places like NOAA and USGS for, potential climate change funding that might be able to support projects like that, or look at cost sharing agreements, things like that we could do with other organizations to fund a position like that.
Yeah, excellent. That's great. Well, so we've kind of gone through some of the priority species and how you've structured the organization. How, looking at the website, it looks like your programs primarily break down at the highest level, really kind of into two buckets, if you will, research and education. And then within each of those, there's a whole diversity of approaches.
That's right.
That you guys take. So let's start with that research bucket. And, I'd like to just kind of walk through that bucket, if you will, and talk about the different components of how you guys are doing research, funding research, and how you structure those, and get into specifics about different programs. So I'll let you kind of break out how you think research should be described, but is there a certain category you want to start with?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, research is a pretty broad category, right? And that encompasses both our grants program and the research that we're carrying out internally. And, the research that we're carrying out internally are somewhat spatially limited and also funding limited on what we're able to do. But, a big project that we're presently working on is a artificial refugia project for eastern diamondbacks, where we're looking at using artificial refugia in areas where gopher tortoises have been largely extirpated, to use as a supplement for refugia sites that hopefully will help that species recolonize areas where maybe they've been pushed out of. In particular, we're thinking of areas that have had heavy forest management where, there's not a lot of biodiversity in the area that's supporting the species. And presently we're looking at a few different options where, we have artificial refugia set up in kind of ideal areas for the species to see whether or not they would use it if they had the option, compared to having gopher tortoise burrows and other types of refugia, as well as in areas where we're not sure whether the species occurs there or not. And that project is presently in its infancy. We've got 6 separate field sites set up with a number of other ones that we're working on deploying. But there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered, as to whether or not the species will use these sites, which we know that eastern diamondbacks and other rattlesnake species certainly will use artificial refugia, but there's a lot that we don't know about what variables make them decide it's a good place to hunker down and stay there. Is it like many or really all snake species, microclimate differences really can influence whether or not a snake decides to use an area. One side of a rock can be a very different microclimate than another side of a rock. So, looking at what influences that in these artificial refugia will help us better understand if this is a conservation tool that we want to use, whether it's temporarily or long-term in some areas. We've also been looking at a lot of studying of disease spread in the Southeast in particular. Our team working with University of Florida discovered a couple of novel viruses in eastern diamondbacks. Two of them were paramyxoviruses, and another one was an atadodenovirus in the species in the wild, and trying to just better understand how that's influencing species populations, as well as partnering with other researchers like Jenna Palmisano and others that are collecting data on pentostomids in the species. And that's not just focused on eastern diamondbacks. It's really any incidental finds that we find in the field. We'll collect swabs from those animals to take back to the lab and test for any potential viruses or invasive pentostomids, things like that. Our other research projects right now that we've got going forward, we've got a large monitoring project up in Michigan, working with Land Conservancy up there, helping monitor populations of the species across some pretty large areas, where we're using some non-invasive monitoring techniques like the Adrift system, which uses game cameras to take photos of snakes and ID later, which is a really neat project.
This would be on Massasaugas.
That's right. Yeah, for eastern Massasaugas. And then the other big one that's really eating up a lot of our time right now, which is, an amazing program, is the work we're doing with Dr. Andy Holycross in the desert Southwest in Mexico, where we're looking at genetic augmentation of the U.S. populations of New Mexico ridge-nosed rattlesnakes, where we're actually taking animals from the Sierra San Luis in Mexico, captively breeding some of them, as well as translocating individual animals to certain mountain ranges in the United States to help rescue a declining population that's become genetically depauperate.
Yeah. And so that covers a lot of it sounds like the research that you guys are doing in a very direct way. I know a lot of it's partnership driven and all of that, but I want to get into the grants and talk about that a little bit. But first, you're kind of in an interesting position in that you had one part of your life or your career working in conservation and management agencies for, the government. But, that's always the interesting thing with research, and we deal with this. This is a huge part of our mission and model, is that connection between science and conservation and doing both and making sure it happens. So I guess a couple questions in there, but you're doing these research programs for rattlesnakes and you're funding, we'll talk about those in a minute, but you're funding, but you have this big bucket of research projects. What are you doing and what has your experience, your career experience, lended to this? But what are you doing to ensure that the research projects you're doing are linked to on the ground conservation action? How do you build that link?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of critical issue analysis that goes into whether or not this is going to make a difference for the species. And I probably drive my staff insane sometimes when I put them on the spot and ask them, like, what is this going to do to help the species in the long run when we're coming up with research questions? And, I generally have the same couple of questions anytime someone comes to me with a research project that they're thinking about, because, while monitoring of rattlesnake populations or any species population is needed, and it's something that needs to be done, when we've got a limited pot of money, we have to think critically about how we're going to be effective with those dollars and ensure we're serving the people that are supporting our organization as well, to ensure that we're meeting our mission. And we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how that's going to make a difference. How is it an active conservation project? Because we don't want all of our research programs to just be monitoring a sinking ship without looking for potential solutions. And there's some triage in that, right? There's times where, we'll stand up a research program, you get a couple years into it and you realize, hey, this is a dead end. We can't keep focusing time and effort on this, and we need to shift our focus to something that does have an on-the-ground focus. So, in my mind, often when we have research projects come in, I'm thinking about what is most useful to a land manager, a decision maker, or a policy maker at various government agencies and others. So, when we think about things like the artificial refugia project we're working on, how can this be used to inform management recommendations for, say the Forest Service or Fish and Wildlife Service refuges, things like that are things that could be built into agreements that, could be used as part of like larger conservation agreements that, could preclude the need for, federal protections for species. But we're certainly not shy to speak up and get involved when, we believe that federal protections are warranted for a species and want to ensure that, we're using science-based decision making and ensuring that the government agencies that are responsible for them do the same.
Yeah. Okay. Well, before we get to the grants, you just hit a tangent that I want to go on for a minute because it's interesting, if nothing else. But these artificial refugia, I'm very familiar, say, with the refugia that were created, say, in the Pine Barrens for pine snakes, or we with the OCIC, the Indigo Snake Captive Breeding Facility in Florida, it was for a captive purpose, but we developed artificial gopher tortoise burrows, and so I'm just curious, just talk a little bit about the design of these artificial burrows and how you ended up designing them and determining that they would be effective, and what do they look like? How are they engineered?
Mm-hmm. Well, first off, we don't know if they're going to be effective yet or not. We're still trying to learn, right?
Study.
We're trying to learn what makes them the most effective. And, certainly Bob Zappalorti's work up in the Pine Barrens, was an inspiration for some of this. And I know in the past he had previously done some work in the Southeast setting up some of these, but there wasn't really any long-term monitoring on any of the refugia work in the Southeast, at least that I'm aware of. Maybe there's some out there that I don't know about or private individuals have done. But a big part of what we're doing is trying to look at, is there a time lag? Like, how long is a time lag before an animal decides to use it after you put a refugia out? Are there animals that are coming up and exploring around the artificial refugia and choosing not to use it? And if so, can we figure out what variables influence them not using it versus choosing it as a suitable site? Is it a tool that can be used in translocation to get snakes to stay in an area long term after we move them? As far as the engineering, the construction of these, I mean, frankly, they're a bit haphazard, right? We have to work with some of the resources that we've got. Some of them are in, hard to reach areas, so we can't bring a bunch of materials and things like that out there. And we also don't want them to be super identifiable by the public when they're walking by, where somebody might bother one of these sites or decide to go kill some study animals at one of the sites and things like that. So, most of what we're doing with these, they're usually partially dug out into the ground, and we're using things like corrugated pipes or similar to allow entrance down into this refugia underground that's reinforced, with some plywood, 2x4s, things like that. And the entire refugia is then covered up with, substrate from the area, some vegetation, things like that, to make sure it's got nice thermal insulation properties. But one of the things that we'll be looking at with the study and in the long run is using a number of different OTM's operational temperature model loggers, like eye buttons, where we're putting them all over the inside and outside of the refugia to look at kind of what does that microclimate inside and outside of the refugia look like, and what encourages the snakes to be there. And there's also a lot of work that goes into deciding where we want to put one of these as well. We can't just say, hey, we're going to put it out on X Forest Service lands or water management lands or whatever, right? We have to think about, okay, within this area, do we know if the species has been seen in this area recently? And then go to the site and actually try and identify areas we think the species would likely be foraging and moving around, edge habitats and things like that, that would be an ideal location for a refugia site. So we don't just want to go put it out in the middle of a big agricultural field where it's going to bake, and this, at least with eastern diamondbacks, are not necessarily really going to want to go out and check out.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about the research grants. Obviously, it's a big part of what you do, and maybe you can give a few highlights. But obviously, there's probably so many of them, we're not going to go through every single one. But maybe talk about the research grant programs, how that idea came up, how you structure them, how you make decisions about what's funded, how you decide what types of projects will have the greatest effect on the species you're concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Chris. And, early on as an organization, when we first started providing grants for this, we weren't really sure where to start on a framework for deciding who should get funding. We knew that we wanted to make sure that anything that we were funding was, number one, ethical. Number two, it's coming from a reliable source that's doing the research work that we know that it's going to get carried out. And number three, that it would tie back to our goals of having on-the-ground conservation benefits of our research programs. And, throughout the years, it's certainly evolved into more complex analysis than that. We've got a big grant scoring rubric, and we have an entire group of external and internal researchers that get together to review those proposals every year, and then they'll usually provide a recommendation to myself and the board of directors on kind of the top 5 research projects that they'd like to see funded that meet a lot of the criteria that we're looking for. And from there, depending on what the funding availability looks like from us as an organization for the year, we'll either provide grants for all of those projects, partial funding for all of them, or we'll select one or two that we want to fund. But a big thing, as in my position or from my perspective with these projects, is that we really like to fund ongoing projects that we can provide continued funding on an annual basis to them for the future, because there's a lot of organizations that provide like one-off funding, and it's great. It helps a lot of people get research stood up, but getting the additional funding for the third year of the dissertation, the fourth year, going into a postdoc, that's where it gets really challenging challenging for people a lot of times to track down extra money and really be able to round out a research project that is able to answer those questions that could inform management decisions, right? It's often really difficult to create and execute an entire study in a year or two, with a single bit of funding. So we usually try to, for all of our projects that we fund, make a commitment to some level of continued funding after the first year that they submit to them. And we follow up with them. And depending on the project, in some cases, our team stays actively involved in the research project ourselves, whether we're providing, geospatial support from, folks aren't in that GIS background, helping with statistical analysis, getting out in the field, helping them with that. Sometimes they just need extra data collection, whether they need, venom samples or cloacal swabs, whatever, right? Things that we can help them just get additional data to inform their projects. So, all of those things kind of tie back into and influence projects that we're going to fund. We really want things that we can stay actively involved in, as much as possible. We're certainly not looking to take ownership of anyone's project, but we want to be able to help ensure that, there's a good conservation outcome of something that we can use and work with, management agencies and things like that to help influence conservation for rattlesnakes.
If you enjoy listening to the Snake Talk podcast, stay in the loop with the Orianne Society's latest conservation updates from the field. Read about new published research, as well as fascinating insights on the species we work with by following us on social media. Follow, like, share. Let's spread the word. Together, we can make a difference. Find the Orianne Society on Instagram, Facebook, X, or LinkedIn and be part of the conversation.
Well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the other programs that you guys have at the Rattlesnake Conservancy. And in particular, I want to talk about education and outreach, as I know it's a huge component of what you do. There's very few snake people that I bump into that don't talk about your venomous snake training as an example. So I do want to talk about that. But maybe before we get into the trainings, let's just talk about education outreach. It's a hugely important with snakes in general, but certainly with venomous snakes because they obviously have a PR program. So how do you guys go about, working on that big global issue we have, the people's perception of snakes and rattlesnakes in particular?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head in that this is probably one of the most important arms of our organization is implementing education programs. And, like you mentioned, we've got everything ranging from K through 12 education programs to adult education. As you might imagine, one of the biggest challenges that we have as an organization is figuring out ways to create community ownership and conservation of a species that a lot of people really don't like very much, especially in their backyard. And, we've taken a lot of different approaches over the years on how to get people engaged and interested in snakes and rattlesnakes in particular. But one thing that I think really benefits our programs is that, people in general have an inherent curiosity in venomous snakes. And I think helping foster that and helping move people away from, the fear of them towards, that curiosity really makes a big difference. And, certainly the first place that we start is with youth education. I mean, we've got after school programs, we've got something called STEM Station where we do everything, that's not just rattlesnake related. It's about helping create young naturalists and people that are excited about being in nature and engaging in wildlife and kind of celebrating all the wildlife in their backyard. And, those programs happen at our facility. Some of them are in local schools where we go out to schools around our areas, as well as, if we've got volunteers and other parts of the state here in Florida or other parts of the country, we'll go out and, go to different schools. And one of the things we really try to do is ensure that all of our education programs are meeting some of the minimum education requirements for whatever grades are that we're going in and talking to them about. So that helps local teachers find ways to have a good reason to bring us in, and we can talk about snakes and native wildlife and things like that.
Yeah, that's great. That there's obviously a lot of groups and individuals out there doing some form of outreach around reptiles and snakes, which is great. But the fact that you guys are actually paying attention to, STEM requirements or other educational levels and requirements, I think is a really nice component to your programs there. And following up on something you said, like the concept that especially with venomous snakes, like I always, say when I'm giving presentations that nobody's like indifferent to a snake, meaning like, if there's nobody that like is walking through the woods and ignores a rattlesnake like they would a squirrel in a tree, right? But it always like it brings about some kind of emotion in people, whether that's fear or anger or excitement. But the problem is that, from a young age, and maybe there's some genetic components there too, but like, we're taught to really fear these animals. And so I agree with you. I think education on these animals is just absolutely critical. And I find that for a lot of people, flicking that switch from either like fear or anger, those kind of negative views of snakes, to like interest and fascination is really easy in some ways, because everybody's tuned into these animals and they just don't know how to interact with them in a positive way. So so that's great. So
yeah, I think everyone's got a story about a snake, right? And not all of them are positive, or at least perceived to be positive. And one of the things that we've noticed a lot, especially on the adult education side, is that when attention is fed into negative stories, it reinforces, their idea that this is what's going to get attention from people and get a reaction out of someone, right? So, we really try to practice not, jumping down someone's throat if they come up and tell us a story about a snake they killed, or we see a photo on social media, because we don't want to reinforce the behavior that like this is what gets people attention and gets them engaged. So, really try and flip that narrative when we're talking to people. And we've got some really savvy social media folks on our team that, sometimes if we get some nasty comment from somebody on one of our posts about snakes, really trying to break through that barrier with people and, try and get them engaged in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Great way to approach it. How do you guys deal with, so we do a fair amount of education outreach, and how do you deal with, the idea of being, again, strategic, opportunistic, and not getting inundated, meaning, as I'm sure you guys experience, if you're open to it, you could end up doing some form of a snake program, whether that be at an adult group or a scout group. I mean, you could be doing this every single day. We get endless requests to do these types of things, and we've had to come up with ways to be strategic about how we implement our education programs to make sure we're getting the greatest effect. So how do you guys strategically implement outreach and education, so you're not, again, inundated and doing maybe too much and too many things that may not be as productive?
Yeah, I think there's a balance, Chris. And like you said, we get tons and tons of requests, and we have to turn a lot of them away just because we don't have, the staff capacity to go out to all of them. But the way that we look at it is like, where are we going to be able to reach the most people and have the largest impact? And, in some cases that might be participating at, some local conservation festival or something like that. But more often, what we found to be most effective is that our team is really good at taking complex scientific ideas and research and distilling them down into ways that are easy to digest for the public. And, Tiffany Bright on our team, this is something she's really passionate about. I'll give you an example. She worked with one of our other staff members, Alec, and Joseph Colbert at Jekyll Island on developing a tracking activity for kids to use to help better understand how snakes move throughout the year, in particular eastern diamondbacks. And they took real data from this study where, they've been tracking snakes for 5-10 years out there, and created an entire story around a couple of snakes that are on the island, and have this really cool connect the dots activity where the kids learn about the different habitats that, those species are in and things like that. And these activities, which we have quite a few of them on our website under our educator resources tab, are free to use for teachers or other educators, other nonprofits. They can go on there, snag them, download them, print them out and use them for their own activities. So even if we can't physically be there in person, we've got a way to get tools to educators that can help communicate about these ideas and help people have that ownership and conservation.
Yeah, great. Well, let's talk a little bit about these trainings. I mentioned venomous snake handling training, and you may have other trainings that you guys provide. So first of all, how did the idea for this come about? Was it something, there was kind of a demand for it and you guys developed it, or did you develop the concept and hoping that it would catch on?
We started these trainings back in 2017 or so. In response to a federal agency, it was a local military installation in Florida that was looking for some sort of training for the range management staff, forestry staff, and others to safely work around venomous reptiles, because they were getting these things out at their gunfire ranges when they'd have soldiers and things like that going out there. So they really wanted to find a way that they could safely relocate venomous reptiles. And when they approached us about this kind of got the wheels turning for our team, because, as I mentioned earlier, fundraising for a niche conservation group like ours focused on rattlesnakes can be really challenging. This was a good opportunity for us to generate program revenue while also supporting our mission. Very similar to what we were talking about earlier with education, we can't be everywhere at once. So a big part of our training programs is creating advocates that can go out and talk to people in the community about conservation of snakes and why you should or shouldn't relocate a snake and things like that. But we also wanted to be mindful of ensuring that people that were doing any sort of relocation or going and engaging with homeowners or landowners have the right tool set, not only to work safely with the animals, but to make informed science-based decisions about whether or not a snake should be relocated, considering things like disease management in certain parts of the country. We have, snake fungal disease, and we've got invasive pentostomes and all these other things that we're dealing with. And, often early career professionals or people who are just interested in snakes, when they first get into this, their first thought is, I want to run out and relocate every snake that I get a call about that's in someone's backyard. And it's admirable, they're passionate about this, but we wanted to find a way that makes sense for those relocations. So we, after that first training, began developing a curriculum that could be standardized and taught anywhere in the United States. And today, our organization physically teaches classes in 14 different states. We also have partner organizations that teach our curriculum in states in addition to that. And we're doing these classes open to the general public, government, zookeepers. We do private courses for things like solar development companies and forestry companies and things like that all the time. And it's really grown into something that's been a huge support of our mission, not only financially, but also in helping people to understand why they should conserve rattlesnakes in their habitat.
Well, we don't have to go into great detail, but so what you talked about the standardized curriculum. What are the types of things, if somebody was to take this training, what are the types of things that they would be getting as part of the program?
Yeah, so the main course that we teach that the majority of people come through is our level 1 venomous handling training. And that involves 2 days of training. The first day is mainly classroom, where they're learning about local venomous snakes to their area, their anatomy and physiology. They're also learning about venom toxinology and snake bite management. And, the big part of that we're also focusing on is we want people to really understand translocation or relocation of these snakes and when they should or shouldn't do it. And the second day is almost entirely hands-on. We start off the day where they're working with non-venomous species, understanding the techniques to do this safely, and then in the afternoon they're working with a variety of venomous reptiles that are native to this area. And we get a broad spectrum of students in these classes. Some people have never worked with a snake in their life, and we also have had people who have been working with snakes for a really long time that are just looking for some new perspectives and training on how to work with these animals safely.
And so when somebody goes through the course, do they get some level of certification? I mean, do you physically give them a certificate, and are you working to kind of build up the value of that certificate, say, within agencies or other groups? But what do people come out of the course with besides just kind of some level of expertise? Do they physically get some type of certification?
Yeah, they do get a certificate of completion for coming through the course, and it actually is recognized right now in some states for people who want to do like timber rattlesnake monitoring. I know a number of employers out there that require people have taken this training and things like that before they come work there, so that way they know they have kind of a base set of knowledge before they start working for whatever organization it is. But, we've spent a lot of time really trying to build up relationship with state wildlife agencies, federal agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and other organizations like AZA, Association for Zoos and Aquariums, on trying to develop courses that can be acknowledged by their respective agencies or organizations to support their missions.
I have a question for you. It's just kind of from my personal experience. I've been handling venomous snakes, my whole career, and I've taught many people, not in a formal, program situation, but I've taught many people to handle venomous snakes, for their job or whatever it might be. And I've noticed over the years that it's a small percentage of people, but there's a percentage of people that kind of will never be good venomous snake handlers, and it's more like, it doesn't have to do with what they know or they don't know. It's kind of these like innate like things about them, like how their dexterity, how hand-eye coordination, how calm they can be, things like that. And so I've encountered a few people that I've just, are not going to be good snake handlers no matter how much they learn. I'm just curious if you guys have encountered that type of issue, and do you have kind of strategies in the program for helping people get around that? Maybe you have a meditation program part of your venomous snake training. But I'm not sure I agree that there's people that won't ever be able to handle snakes safely. Mm-hmm. I think I agree that maybe there's people that this isn't what they should do for a career in the long term. That's fair.
And
That's fair.
Yeah. And what I tell people and our students is, listen, the way that we're going to teach you is not the easiest way to handle snakes, but it's the safest way to get them contained and relocate them, because that's our priority when we're working with students. And, we push through 15, 20 people in a course over a weekend, and it can be a handful. We'll have 2 or 3 students that are working with everybody. And certainly some students take some more time and effort, but the one beauty about standardizing the way that we do things is that it's done the same way every time, no matter what. And there's some comfort in that for a lot of people, even if there's, like you mentioned, some dexterity issues, or, they have some anxiety about working with the animals, that they get used to the motions of how we do things. And, we tell people, or we teach people to be self-aware of their own limitations, right? If you're somebody who has, a challenge picking up heavier items and things like that, maybe you shouldn't be the one to respond to a call for a very large eastern diamondback, right? And stick with smaller animals like a copperhead or a pygmy rattlesnake, and call in somebody else to help with the big animals. Because, I know, Chris, you've worked with some of these really big rattlesnakes, and frankly, even as a seasoned handler of 6-foot, eastern diamondback that's not happy about you being there is still a handful.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Well, that's great. So if people wanted to get involved, say with venomous snake training or involved with Rattlesnake Conservancy more in general, say becoming a donor to help support the organization, look at the education programs, potentially look at becoming a grant recipient, how do people best interact with the organization and connect with you to support your mission?
Yeah, I mean, they can certainly reach out to us, through any social media platform. We're on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. We have a little bit of a presence on YouTube, but haven't kept up with that as much. Or they're also welcome to reach out to us through our website at savethebuzztails.org. We've got tons of opportunities for people, whether they're looking for, in-person volunteering, if they want to help remotely in some ways. We have a number of different teams that work together with remote volunteers. If anyone's interested in donating to our mission and supporting our research and education programs, that certainly can be done through our website, or reach out directly to one of our team members through the contact us page on our website or on social media, and we'd be happy to connect with them.
Great. Well, it's been a great conversation. I've learned a lot. But before I let you go, I'd like to have all of my guests tell me their best snake story. So do you have a good snake story for us?
Well, I'm probably not the best storyteller in the world, but I'll do my best here. I think one thing that's always been funny to me, and you've maybe heard this from other people who are field researchers or herpers or whatever, is about the pee snake. When you step on the side of the road to go pee. And I think probably my favorite story was when I was out in Arizona, and I had been hunting for banded rock rattlesnakes out there all day. I had been going probably 9 hours, really struggling to find the snakes. It was a little bit too warm out that day, so most of them had already ducked down into the rocks. They had just gotten a late start getting up into the mountains to find them. And it wasn't until the very end of the day where I was literally packing up. I was maybe 20 feet from my car about to leave, and pulled over to, have a leak right before I left, and found a banded rock rattlesnake that was tied up in the bark on one of the trees right on the side of the road not far from the car. And it was just hilarious because I'd spent all day busting hump, going up, all of these rock slides and looking for snakes and all of the ideal areas I could possibly find them. And the whole day it was there 20 feet away from my car, and just happened to do it because I took a few minutes to stop and look around and pay attention.
There you go. That's the secret to finding the elusive species. Pull over and take a pee. Great story. Well, I encourage all of our listeners to go out and check out the Rattlesnake Conservancy and support them. Just wanted to thank you so much for being with us today, Tony.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it.
Great. And I wanted to thank the audience and tell everybody to remember, snakes are animals too, and it's a privilege to see one in the wild.